Welcome back to Storytime Boulevard, your destination to sleep. My name is Andrew, and I'm your host. Tonight, we set sail on an adventure, not just across the ocean, but across the vast landscape of possibility. This is a story about discovery, about trust, and about embracing the unknown. But before we begin, let's take a moment to settle in, to find stillness, to breathe, to prepare ourselves for the journey ahead. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Feel the weight of the day melting away like footprints in the sand, washed gently by the tide. There is nothing you need to do right now except be here. As you breathe, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast ocean. The water is calm, endless, shimmering under a sky full of stars. The air is cool against your skin, the scent of salt and adventure filling your lungs. In front of you, a small paper boat rests in your hands. Light, delicate, yet strong in its own way. This boat represents your journey, your dreams, your courage. Now, with every breath, I invite you to repeat these affirmations in your mind. I am open to the unknown. I trust the journey ahead. Every experience teaches me something valuable. I am exactly where I am meant to be. I embrace change with an open heart. The horizon is not an ending, but a beginning. Take another deep breath in. And as you exhale, imagine yourself placing the paper boat on the water, watching it float forward, carried by the tide. You are ready to sail. And so, our story begins. Theo sat at the very edge of the dock, his feet swinging above the water, his fingers carefully folding a fresh sheet of paper. He was precise with each crease, smoothing the edges so the paper would hold its shape. The little boat he crafted was delicate, yet sturdy in its own way, just like the ones before it, just like the ones he had sent out to sea every day for as long as he could remember. The tide was calm that evening, the water lapping gently against the wooden posts of the dock, whispering secrets only it could understand. The sky was painted in hues of soft lavender and gold. The sun dipping just low enough to kiss the horizon. Theo took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of salt and distant rain. "Off you go," he murmured, placing the tiny paper boat onto the water's surface. For a moment, it simply floated there, uncertain, waiting for the current to take hold. Then, as if answering an unspoken call, the waves carried it away, pulling it toward the vast unknown. Theo watched until it became nothing more than a speck on the horizon. And then it was gone. A familiar voice broke the silence, still hoping for one to come back. Theo turned to see Maran, the village's old fisherman, leaning against a wooden post with his arms crossed. His face, weathered by the sun and sea, held an amused expression. His beard was flecked with grey, his clothes smelling of salt and fish, and his hands, strong and worn, looked as though they had spent a lifetime pulling stories from the depths of the ocean. Theo offered a small smile. Maybe. Marin walked forward and sat beside him on the dock, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He reached for a piece of driftwood floating nearby and absently turned it over in his calloused hands. "You know, when I was your age, I didn't send boats to the sea. I sent messages in bottles." Theo perked up. "Did any ever come back?" Marin chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a single one." He tossed the driftwood back into the water and let out a sigh. "That's the thing about the ocean, lad. It takes. It swallows things up, carries them off to places we'll never know. It doesn't give back." Theo frowned, turning his gaze toward the horizon. He didn't want to believe that. "Maybe you just didn't wait long enough," he said quietly. Marin gave him a sidelong glance, the kind an old man gives to a child who hasn't yet learned the world's hardest lessons. "And what exactly are you waiting for then?" Theo hesitated, his fingers brushing against the splintered wood of the dock. He had been asking himself that question for a long time. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I feel like there has to be something more, something waiting out there." Marin was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled and patted Theo's knee. "Keep watching the tide then. Maybe one day it will surprise you." With that he stood, stretched, and made his way back toward the village, his silhouette fading into the glow of lantern light. Theo remained on the dock long after Marin left. He stayed as the last slivers of sunlight melted into the deep blues of night. He stayed as the stars blinked into existence, dotting the sky like tiny, watchful eyes. And as the waves continued their endless rhythm, Theo folded another boat, just in case. The morning was quiet, the sky still wrapped in the soft, drowsy hues of dawn. A thin mist hovered just above the sea, curling around the dock like a lingering dream. The tide whispered against the shore, pulling and releasing grains of sand in an endless rhythm. Theo sat in his usual spot, hugging his knees to his chest, his chin resting on them. His eyes were heavy with sleep. He had stayed up too late the night before, watching the horizon, whispering silent thoughts to the sea. He was about to close his eyes when something in the water caught his attention. A speck bobbing in the waves. At first, he thought it was just another piece of driftwood, a leaf fallen from a faraway tree. But as the tide carried it closer, his pulse quickened. It was small, delicate, floating just like one of his paper ships. But that wasn't possible. Theo scrambled to his feet, stepping closer to the dock's edge. The little boat drifted nearer, golden in the early morning light. His breath caught. This was not one of his. It wasn't made from the thin, flimsy paper he used, nor did it bear the creases of his hurried folds. This ship was different. Its structure was sturdier, its paper thicker, gleaming as if woven with sunlight itself. The folds were crisp, precise, as though it had been shaped with great care. Theo waded into the shallow water without hesitation, the cold seeping into his skin as he reached out and scooped the tiny vessel into his hands. It was lighter than he expected, but surprisingly firm, as though untouched by the water it had traveled through. His fingers trembled as he turned it over, his heart pounding. Inside, nestled carefully in the hull, was a small slip of parchment. Theo's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he gently pulled it free, unfolding it with careful hands. The message was written in elegant, slanted script, as though penned by someone who had written many letters in their lifetime. The ink shimmered faintly, as if it had been kissed by the very sea itself. Keep sailing. The journey is the destination. Theo read the words again and again. His heart thundered in his chest. Someone, somewhere, had sent this back to him. But who and where from? He turned in a slow circle, scanning the vast expanse of water, as if expecting to see a distant figure waiting on the horizon, watching him. But there was no one, only the endless sea, stretching beyond his sight. For a long moment he stood frozen, clutching the tiny golden ship in his palm, the words on the parchment echoing in his mind. The villagers had told him the sea only took, but they were wrong. The sea had answered. Theo ran through the village, his heart pounding, his fingers gripping the golden paper ship as though it might disappear if he let go. His feet kicked up the dust of the well-worn paths, past the baker, setting fresh loaves on his windowsill, past the old fishermen mending their nets, past the children playing with wooden toys near the marketplace. He needed answers, and there was only one person in the village who might have them. Luna, the storyteller. She was older than anyone could remember, though no one knew exactly how old. Some said she had been there since their grandparents were children. Others whispered that she had travelled to lands no one else dared venture to, collecting stories like seashells and stringing them into the fabric of her being. Theo found her exactly where she always was, seated behind her wooden cart, its surface cluttered with little trinkets, faded maps and scrolls tied with frayed ribbons. A soft breeze tugged at the colourful scarves wrapped around her shoulders, and her silver rings clinked against each other as she absent-mindedly thumbed through an old book. "Luna," Theo called, breathless, as he skidded to a stop in front of her. She looked up, her wise eyes glinting with curiosity. "Well, well, you look like you've outrun the wind itself, little Voyager. What brings you to an old woman's quiet corner?" Theo held out the golden ship, his hands shaking slightly. "This," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "It came back to me." Luna's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze, something knowing. She took the delicate vessel from his hands, turning it over carefully, studying every precise fold, as though reading a language woven into its very creases. "A fine ship," she murmured. "Not made by your hands, I see." Theo nodded vigorously. "I send paper boats out every day, but none have ever returned. This one came back, and inside there was a message." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the tiny slip of parchment. He unfolded it and handed it to her. Luna traced the words with the tip of her finger. "Keep sailing The journey is the destination. She let the words hang in the air for a long moment. Theo leaned forward. What does it mean? Luna smiled, the kind of smile that held stories far older than the village itself. That depends, she said. What do you think it means? Theo hesitated. He had been so focused on finding an answer that he hadn't stopped to consider what the message truly meant to him. I don't know, he admitted. But I think someone is telling me to go, to sail beyond the village. Luna nodded, as if pleased by his answer. Perhaps they are. Theo frowned. But who sent it? She chuckled softly, her rings glinting as she folded the golden ship back into his hands. Not all questions have answers, little Voyager. At least, not right away. But someone had to have sent it, Theo insisted. Ships don't just appear from nowhere. Luna leaned forward, lowering her voice, as if sharing a great secret. Ah, but they do. Sometimes the sea carries things where they are needed, not where they are expected. Theo swallowed, looking down at the ship. So what do I do now? Luna reached for a worn leather pouch beside her and pulled out a small hand-carved compass. She pressed it into his palm. You have a choice, she said. You can stay here, wondering forever. Or you can follow the message and sail toward the unknown. Theo stared at the compass, its needle trembling, as if sensing the possibilities ahead. The thought of leaving scared him, but the thought of never knowing scared him even more. Luna smiled again, softer this time. The sea has whispered to you, child. The question is, will you listen? Theo tightened his grip around the golden ship and the compass. He already knew the answer. The next morning, the village stirred with whispers. The boy who had sent paper ships to sea was preparing for something far greater. Theo stood at the water's edge, his bare feet sinking into the cool sand as he looked out at the endless horizon. His heart beat like a drum in his chest, not with fear, but with the electric hum of possibility. He had made his decision. He would sail. Marin had grumbled when Theo told him his plan, but the old fisherman had also sighed in that way that meant he had expected this all along. And so, despite his protests, he helped. You'll need more than paper and dreams to survive out there, lad, Marin had muttered as he led Theo to his boatyard. We'll build you something proper. And so, under the watchful eyes of the villagers, they built a small but sturdy vessel. It was no grand ship, but it was seaworthy. A modest wooden boat, just large enough for Theo and his supplies. Luna, the storyteller, had been there too, watching from the shade of her cart with a knowing smile. She had pressed a small leather satchel into Theo's hands before he left. For the road, or rather, the waves, she had said. Inside the satchel, Theo had found a loaf of sweet bread wrapped in cloth, a small flask of water, and a few folded maps with inked lines that hinted at lands beyond the village's reach. But the most precious thing inside was something he already carried. The golden paper ship and its message. By the time the boat was finished, the sun was heavy in the sky, dipping toward evening. The tide was right. The wind was waiting. And so, with the villagers gathered along the shore, Theo prepared to leave. Marin stood beside him, arms crossed, the usual scowl on his face softened by something else, something almost like pride. You're stubborn as the tide, lad, the old fisherman muttered. No stopping you now, is there? Theo grinned, shaking his head. No stopping me now. Marin sighed and handed him a rope of dried fish. For the journey, try not to get yourself drowned. Theo laughed, tucking the gift into his satchel. Then he turned to Luna, who simply gave him a nod. Her gaze shimmering like the surface of the sea at dawn. The horizon is a story waiting to be told, little Voyager, she said. Tell it well. Theo swallowed the lump in his throat, then climbed aboard his boat. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the oars. But when he looked out toward the horizon, his fear melted into something else. Exhilaration. The tide pulled at the boat, eager to take him forward. He looked back one last time at the village he had always known, at the people who had shaped his days. Mara, Luna, the children playing in the sand, the baker setting out his last loaves for the evening, the familiar world of the shore. Then, with a deep breath, Theo pushed forward, letting the wind and water take him. The village faded behind him, and ahead, the open sea stretched wide. For the first time in his life, Theo was no longer sending ships into the unknown. He was sailing into it himself. The first night at sea was silent, save for the whisper of the wind and the gentle lapping of waves against the hull of Theo's small boat. The sky stretched endlessly above him, a sea of stars mirroring the one below. Theo lay on his back, his hands resting on his chest, staring up at the constellations he had only ever seen from the shore. Out here, with no lanterns, no village fires, the stars burned brighter, more alive. For the first time, he was no longer a boy, watching from the dock. He was part of the vastness. The golden paper ship lay beside him, the message still tucked inside. He traced the edges with his fingers, feeling the weight of the words he had yet to understand. Keep sailing. The journey is the destination. And so he did. On the second day, Theo spotted land in the distance. A small island that seemed to float in the mist like a forgotten dream. The air around it shimmered strangely. And as Theo rowed closer, an eerie stillness settled over the water. He stepped onto the shore cautiously. The trees were frozen mid-sway, their branches caught in an invisible wind that had long since passed. A waterfall poured from the rocks above, but the water never reached the pool below. It was suspended in mid-air, droplets glistening like glass. Theo walked forward, his footsteps muffled in the silence. Even the air felt thick, unmoving. It was as if the island itself had stopped breathing. Then he saw them. Scattered along the beach were half-buried footprints, some large, some small. A few led toward the trees, others toward the water, but none continued. It was as though the people who had once walked here had simply disappeared. A shiver crawled up Theo's spine. He bent down and ran his fingers through the sand. It was cool, untouched. He had the strangest feeling that if he stayed too long, he too would become trapped in time, frozen like the trees, like the waterfall, like the ghosts of those before him. He clutched the golden ship in his pocket and whispered, "Not this place, not yet." And so he turned back to his boat, pushing away from the island just as a gust of wind rippled through the stillness, as if the island exhaled. By the third night, Theo had grown used to the endless stretch of water. He no longer feared the silence. But that night, the silence broke. Beneath him, the sea began to glow. Theo scrambled to the edge of the boat, peering into the depths. At first, he thought it was the moon's reflection, but then they moved. A school of fish, their bodies shimmering like lanterns, swam beneath his boat in perfect unison. Their fins pulsed softly, leaving trails of gold and blue light in their wake. Theo watched in awe as they swirled around him, forming intricate patterns, as if painting stories in the dark water. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the fish darted forward, their glow fading into the deep. Theo exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He could still see their light dancing behind his eyelids. The sea held more magic than he had ever imagined. The fourth day brought a storm. The wind roared, pulling at the sail of Theo's boat. Waves crashed against the hull, tossing him side to side. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, blotting out the sun. Theo gripped the oars, his knuckles white. He had never seen a storm this fierce. But then, he heard it. A voice. Not one, but many. The wind whispered. At first it was only a murmur, a distant hum woven into the storm's howling. But as Theo listened closer, the words became clearer. Fragments of lost thoughts, memories drifting through the wind, like echoes. I should have gone with him. I wonder if she ever read my letter. I wish I had taken the chance. Regrets. The storm was speaking in the voices of those who had never left. Theo's chest tightened. He thought of Mara, the old fisherman, who had only ever sent messages, but never received one back. He thought of the villagers, who told stories of places they would never visit. And then he thought of himself, how close he had come to being one of them. Clutching the golden ship, he shouted into the storm, his voice carried by the wind. I am not afraid. The whispering voices faded. The wind died down. The waves softened, and the storm passed. On the fifth morning, Theo awoke to something astonishing. The water around him was not just blue, it was every color at once. Swirls of emerald green, streaks of deep violet, pools of shimmering gold. And beneath the surface, the waves didn't move in one direction. They split apart, Some waves carried currents north, others curled east. Some looped in circles, others stretched in straight lines, leading to places unknown. Theo stared, mesmerized. The sea was offering him a choice. He pulled the golden note from his pocket, reading it one last time. Keep sailing. The journey is the destination. Theo smiled. He didn't need to know which path led where, because for the first time he understood. It had never been about reaching one place. It had always been about sailing itself. And so, with the wind at his back and the whole world ahead, Theo chose a path and kept sailing. Theo had been gone long enough for the village to wonder if they would ever see him again. Some thought the sea had swallowed him, just as it swallowed all things. Others believed he had simply become part of the horizon, like the sun melting into the waves at dusk. But on the 12th morning, just as the tide was beginning to turn, a silhouette appeared against the rising sun. A boat, small but steady. A boy stood at the helm, wind-touched and sun-kissed. His once simple clothes, now faded from salt and time. His hair was tangled. His hands were calloused. And his eyes held the reflection of places no villager had ever seen. Theo had returned. The villagers gathered at the shore, murmuring in hushed awe. The boy who had once sent paper ships to sea had become a voyager. Marion stood at the dock, arms crossed, squinting against the sunlight as Theo pulled his boat into the shallows. Still in one piece, I see, the old fisherman grumbled. Theo grinned, hopping out and splashing into the knee-deep water. Mostly, Marin eyed the boat, running his fingers over the hull. It was worn but unbroken, a testament to the journey it had taken. Well, did you find what you were looking for? Theo hesitated. Before he left, he had expected answers. Something clear. Something final. But the sea had given him something else. 1,000 questions. 1,000 paths. 1,000 stories. He had not found one single answer, but he had found everything else. Theo smiled, slipping the golden paper ship from his pocket and pressing it into Marine's hand. Yes, he said simply, but not in the way I expected. Mary turned the tiny vessel over, in his weathered fingers, his rough hands careful, with its delicate folds. His expression softened, but he said nothing. Instead, He gave Theo a small, gruff nod, the kind of nod men gave when words weren't enough. Luna was waiting for him by her cart, wrapped in scarves of deep indigo and burnt gold. Her silver rings caught the morning light as she reached for her cup of tea. "You've seen things," she said. Before Theo could even speak, Theo laughed, shaking his head. "I have." She motioned for him to sit, and he did, sinking into the familiar creak of the wooden bench. It felt different now, smaller in a way. "Tell me," Luna said, her voice rich with curiosity. "Tell me what the sea showed you." Theo thought about the island where time stood still, the lantern fish glowing in the deep, the storm that whispered of lost regrets, the sea that split into infinite paths. But most of all, he thought about the message he had carried with him all this time. Keep sailing, the journey is the destination. Luna's eyes twinkled. "And do you understand it now?" Theo exhaled slowly, watching the steam curl from her tea. "I think so," he said. "I thought I was looking for an ending, but the sea doesn't give endings. It just keeps moving." Luna nodded approvingly. Wise words for a boy who once thought the world ended at the horizon. Theo chuckled. "I guess the horizon isn't the end of things after all." Luna smiled. "No, it never was." That night, as the village settled into sleep, Theo walked to the dock where it all began. The same wooden planks, the same endless tide, but he was not the same. He sat cross-legged, folding a fresh piece of parchment with careful, steady hands. His fingers worked from memory, pressing the paper into shape. Crease by crease, fold by fold, until another tiny boat sat in his palm. Then, on a slip of parchment, he wrote a message of his own. Something for the next dreamer, something for the next restless heart. He tucked the note into the ship's hull, then gently set it onto the water's surface. The tide pulled at it, taking it forward, taking it somewhere. Theo smiled as he watched it disappear into the unknown, because now he knew someone, somewhere would find it, and their own adventure would begin. The end. And so, dear dreamer, our journey comes to a close for tonight. But remember, just like the waves, the story never truly ends. It carries on, in the choices you make, in the dreams you dare to chase, in the quiet moments where you simply trust the journey. Thank you for sailing with us on Storytime Boulevard, where every tale is a doorway to wonder, and every night is an invitation to dream. May your heart be light, your spirit at peace, and your mind filled with gentle thoughts as you drift into sleep. You are safe, you are loved, and tomorrow a new adventure awaits. Rest well, Voyager. Until next time.